I don't think any of us give this enough thought, but making a sequel to pretty much anything must be an incredibly difficult task. When it comes to expanding on the ideas present in that first entry, there are so many approaches that one can take, each of which produces vastly different results. That's also not to mention the amount of weight sequels tend to have on their shoulders, as with every sequel ever made, people are going to judge it in comparison to its predecessor and are expecting it to be as good, if not even better than the previous installment. These things generally have a lot to live up to, and the amount of pressure and stress that goes into making one must be absolutely devastating on the devs' part. And I can only imagine that that was the very scenario that Capcom was in when developing a sequel to megamanx, a game that was an absolute success in every sense of the word, but still had some room to grow. Ironing out the kinks of such an acclaimed game, as well as taking said idea to new heights, is quite a bit to ask for. Even still, despite how well it turned out, a sequel to such a revered game could also potentially run the risk of living under its shadow and never really being held in quite the same regard. I mean, that issue in particular was a dime a dozen during this era, but alas, against all odds, megamanx 2 seemed to be up to the challenge. Now, as previously mentioned, X1 was the very first game in the X series that I played. Then, as previously mentioned, I didn't get very far in it. X2 was the very next game that I decided to try out, and to say that this formula clicked with me wouldn't be doing that statement justice at all. I've always heard how the first game was this fast-paced action spectacle of a 2D platformer, and although I would eventually come to see that, I've always seen that more with X2. The dashing, the energy, the atmosphere, the thrill, all that made so much more sense when I played this game, and it's a testament to how strong of a follow-up X2 is that an uncultured 13-year-old could pick it up and still have an absolute blast with it. I'm just gonna come out and say it now, this is my favorite X game. It has been for the better part of 5 years. However, the more I got into the Mega Man fandom, I started to notice that X2 wasn't really brought up in the same regard as X1. When comparing it to the rest of the series, people still consider X2 to be one of the good ones, but people just don't talk about this game, if that makes any sense. It's not nearly as discussed as some of the best or even some of the worst games that the series has to offer. As is the fate with many sequels released during this time, X2 was an unfortunate victim of being overshadowed. And me no likey. In the years since my first playthrough, X2 has consistently gotten better and better each and every time I completed it. It offered me more, it satisfied me more, it challenged me more, and it was the game that opened my eyes on how good this style of gameplay can actually be, and in my humble opinion is a game that should be regarded as one of the very best in the entire series. Ladies and gentlemen, nerds and geeks, and all my queer and non-binary peeps, this is megamanx 2. Now, in X1, the opening was, by design, pretty basic. It introduced the mechanics of the game, presented some important story beats, and made me confused. But aside from that, one of my biggest issues with this intro stage is the fact that it's not at all what the rest of the game is going to look like. Now, again, this was an intentional design choice. The stage was meant to be simple in order to familiarize newcomers who previously played the classic series and introduce them to the newer mechanics in a relatively safe environment. It does work, and it's a choice that makes a lot of sense, but in my opinion, X2 has always done this better. Right off the bat, it starts off guns blazing. The atmosphere is more intense, the music is more electric, and it just punches you in the gut with action. X rides his hover cycle while being shot at by everything in sight, and then rides his bike straight into one of the enemies, officially kicking this adventure off. So already, this game was leaving a much stronger first impression just off the first couple seconds alone. But when I actually go and control X, this is where some of the really big improvements start showing themselves. Getting the big one out of the way first, X can now perform the dash the very second you start the game. I know it doesn't sound like much, but being able to use the dash for the entirety of the game just makes it so much easier to replay. The devs knew how integral this move was to the game's level design, and how it gave the X series its own distinct hook. And besides, given how well X1 sold, it's a pretty safe assumption that you've already played that game before jumping into this one. Regardless, this addition makes so much sense, and the intro stage perfectly utilizes it to great effect. The stage in general is just so much more exciting and dynamic, with things constantly moving, structures constantly collapsing, and tons of verticality, which, hey, I actually learned how to wall jump thanks to this very room. I don't know, I guess having the walls come closer together, as well as really putting you under pressure and forcing you to make a decision, is a much more effective way of teaching me things, I guess. But it all concludes with a boss that's pretty quick, pretty easy, which, yes, it does lack the tension and importance of the Valve fight, but it also does a much better job in keeping the pace of the game alive and flowing, which is really everything that this first stage exemplifies. Right within the first couple of minutes, X2 gives an accurate representation of what the experience is actually like. It's a game that's fast, that's frantic, and that's full of action. And it speaks to how well designed this stage is that even with how much more was asking from me, I was still able to get through it and have an absolute blast while doing so. Really good first impression if I do say so myself. However, as someone who might be going into this game already playing its predecessor, you will for sure be going into the game with quite a bit of questions. The game says that it's been 6 months since the last game, but it doesn't really let you in on much else. That is, until you meet these 3 dorks. These guys are known as the X Hunters, beings that are watching X's every move in an attempt to ready themselves for battle. It should also be mentioned that Zero, the being who sacrificed himself to save you in the last game, is still in tow, or at least his parts are. Each of these guys carries a piece of your fallen ally, and they plan on killing and dispatching X in a similar manner. However, we're getting way ahead of ourselves here. How about we let them do that while we go and speak to you. Nerds and geeks, this is Dr. Kane. Just to add a bit more lore, Dr. Kane was the person who actually discovered X in the remains of Light's laboratory. He was the one responsible for using X and his ability to think for himself to create the race of Reploids that we see roaming around the streets. Which would also mean that he'd be responsible for the numerous amounts of Mavericks killing people and doing a bunch of crimes because again, they can think for themselves. Essentially, what I'm trying to say here is that this whole war against the Reploids and Mavericks is entirely Kane's fault. But let's not get sidetracked, alright? The point that matters is that Kane and X have an established relationship. And as such, Kane pretty much takes the role of Dr. Light in the classic series. He just kind of sits around, not really doing much of anything until X needs him. Okay, I mean, that's not entirely fair. He does warn X about the X Hunters, and he does seem like a very wise and intelligent man, but I just don't really care about him. But finally, we enter the stage select and the game can properly begin. And once again, I just want to highlight just how genius of a design choice giving you the ability to dash from the start is, because now, any one of the 8 main Mavericks can be chosen as a viable first pick. The biggest side effect of not giving you the dash after the intro stage in the last game was that you were pretty much locked into picking Chill Penguin first because, well, you wanted that dash. You know how much more fun and satisfying the game becomes when you have it. But seeing that you can only get it in this one place, that means that every time you go back to this game, you're going to be starting it in the exact same way. Just to be clear, that's not that big of a deal breaker, but in X2, there's just so much more freedom. None of your playthroughs ever start off the same, and it just leads this game, again, being a lot easier to replay. And it also helps, it really helps, that each of these Mavericks are home to some of the best stages in megamanx history. Nearly everything I adored about the stages in the first game have been further amplified and expanded upon here, and I love it. I love it so much. Not to jab at X1 too much, but as previously stated, the stages in that game seem to emphasize combat quite a hefty amount. And while that's not a deal breaker at all, at least to me, I much prefer it when the game is focused on actual platforming and uses that increased speed to create this sense of flow and rhythm as I leap and launch across all these areas. X2 doubles down on this incredibly hard. Nearly all of these levels have designs that capture that sense of crunch almost to a T. The core combat remains as satisfying as ever, with loads more different enemy types that are sure to keep you on your toes, and there is a lot of different methods of going about fighting them, whether it be the return ride armors, or even with X's new motorbike, which is yet another thing that I love about these levels. In general, these levels have a lot more notable and action-packed set pieces. Whether you're climbing up this shaft as lava chases underneath you, or dashing through this factory with spotlights everywhere and avoiding being discovered. This game just has so many more moments where it attempts to make the player feel like a badass, and it's something that I just can't ever get tired of. Just as I can't get tired of finding the various different collectibles hidden throughout the game. Now, in terms of the devs' philosophy for where to hide things in this game, they made it so that the challenge was more so in getting them rather than finding them. A good amount of them are still pretty hidden, like this heart tank, which is just sadistic, but a lot of these, although they can still be pretty concealed, more so test you on if you have the skills to even reach them in the first place. This by itself makes obtaining these items a lot more satisfying. However, it gets so much better when you realize that a lot of these upgrades can be obtained in more than one way. A few do require the use of another upgrade, whether it be a Maverick weapon or one of the armor parts, but for those who are clever enough and skilled enough, it is totally possible to find alternative methods to get these items a lot earlier than what was originally intended. But I want to actually take some time and talk about the pieces of the second armor, which yes, these sets do actually have official names, as unoriginal as they are, but if you want to talk about upgrades that truly improve the experience of the game, look no further. Let's take a gander here, shall we? First off, we got the headpiece, which has this little scanner thingy built into it that can sniff out locations of nearby upgrades. To be honest, this one is kinda lame, as it's a weapon that you have to manually switch to in order to use, and 9 times out of 10, if you use this thing, you probably already know where the upgrade is hiding anyway, so what's even the point? Anyways, then there's the chest piece, which again, cuts your damage intake in half, as well as, if you switch to it and make sure you take enough electrical damage, can generate this massive explosion that demolishes everything on screen. Like what? I love this. This is so cool. Why the hell didn't Light give me this earlier? Then we got the new Dashy Boots, which instead of giving you the ability to dash, now grants you the ability to dash in mid-air, which may not be as cool as blowing stuff up with your chest, but it definitely still has its uses, especially towards the end of the game. However, surprising absolutely no one, the arm pieces far and away have the coolest perks, granting you the ability to charge your weapons, as well as get not one, but 2 whole charge shots. And not only can you choose to use one but still hold in the other, but they straight up ignore boss invincibility frames. Like dude, this is awesome. No question about it, this is incredibly broken and a tad bit unbalanced, but I could care less. This is easily better than the first armor and is one of the best armor sets in the entire series, full stop. Man, like, it's just thanks to all these features, both big and small, that makes X2 such an unbelievably rewarding and satisfying experience. Both in terms of its mechanics and its design, it is every bit as well put together as its predecessor, and in many ways it's even better than that. However, even still, there are a couple of things that I do kind of miss from X1. The aesthetics and the graphics in X2, albeit with a couple of glaring exceptions, tends to be even more darker and muted than before. Yeah, again, it's meant to have a much more sinister and edgier art style, but I don't know. The landscapes and the backgrounds just don't really seem that appealing to me in comparison to X1. The soundtrack, which yeah, is something that I forgot to mention last time, is also a pretty large step down for me. In X1, each track had so much energy and electricity to them. And while there are still a few bangers within these stages, many of them are pretty forgettable, and 0 of them are on my BGM playlist. And speaking of things I completely forgot to mention last time, because I'm just so professional with this YouTube thing, don't you know? X1 also had this really cool addition to where, depending on which stage you would beat, it would have an effect on another one of the stages, which 1 is incredibly fantastic world building, and 2 adds a lot in terms of your routing, as certain collectibles can only be obtained by certain versions of the stage. That unfortunately isn't really a thing anymore in this game. None of the stages really seem to be impacted by you killing a previous Maverick, which is one of the few missed opportunities when it comes to this game's routing. But make no mistake, even without that, X2 still has some very complicated routing, even more so than in the first game. So earlier in the video, I mentioned the X Hunters, right? Well, after killing 2 of the Mavericks, these guys will start showing up in the main stages as depicted by this nifty map that we got here. The only way you're going to be encountering these guys is if you seek out the boss door hidden within every stage. Keep in mind that these guys also have the pieces of Zero, so beating them will result in you getting a piece of your fallen ally. However, you really want to keep an eye on them as well as how many Mavericks you're killing, as the more Mavericks you hunt down, the less likely that they are to appear, and they straight up stop appearing altogether after a certain point. Now, with all that information, I just want to preface this by saying that this is indeed a side quest, and you can completely ignore this part of the game if you want to. However, those who do choose to do it are in for a pretty enjoyable challenge. The secret boss doors that you have to enter are usually pretty well hidden and require a lot of wit and skill to access, similar to the other collectibles within the game. And the bosses themselves are really good. They're easily harder than any of the Mavericks as they hit really stinking hard, but they have very interesting attack patterns, and if you know what you're doing, they become very exploitable. Now, the most important thing about these guys is how with every Maverick that you dispatch, these guys will move around the map to different stages. Again, this isn't going to matter to you if you're only going after the Mavericks, but it's thanks to this single addition that adds so many more variables to picking your next stage, as the stages that these guys choose to go are completely random. It's not uncommon for you to have a route planned out in your mind, only for it to completely change because Surges just want to mess with you and go somewhere entirely different. There's so much more thinking you have to do when you go after these guys, and it's actually thanks to this why, unlike literally every other Mega Man game in existence, I don't really have a specific boss order when playing this game. I mainly just kinda go after whoever, whenever. And although the side quest is part of the reason why, the main reason has to do with the vast improvement on the bosses and how they're designed. Don't get me wrong, a decent amount of bosses in the last game were still pretty well balanced, but there were still a lot of them that hit way too hard and have attacks that are a bit too fast. I'd be lying if I said that I didn't give at least a few of these guys some Spark Mantle syndrome. But when comparing it to X2, it is night and day. First off, they move a great deal slower, their attacks are a lot more readable, but also, they're just so much more fun to fight. It actually helps a lot that a few of these guys have their own unique arenas, which allow for their attacks to have a lot more creativity and be a lot more interesting to dodge and counter against. Realistically, aside from Wheel Gator who just sits in crap all game, and Bubble Crab, which suffers from the exact same issues as X1's bosses, I feel comfortable in fighting every single one of these guys with only my Buster. And in all cases, I find it to be my preferred way of fighting them because I simply get more out of those boss fights that way. X2 is such a dense and beefy game, man. No matter which angle you look at from, this game is endlessly replayable, and I'm just shocked more than anything at just how well they were able to achieve this. There's always something new to discover and experiment with in this game, and that's the primary reason for why I come back to this game so incredibly often. But after a certain point, whenever you feel like you're ready, you'll be granted access to Sigma's new lair, which the game actually confirms to be on an island. In terms of how these stages are, well, they're fine. They're okay. These levels generally have a lot more stuff going on and very cleverly use set pieces that act as more difficult iterations from obstacles that you've previously encountered. They're still pretty challenging and ask a lot from you, but it still feels like everything carries that same flow and rhythm present in previous levels. Except for when, it doesn't. Yeah, a good chunk of these levels do feature a lot of experimental designs. It is that point in the game where they start using a lot more gimmicks, mainly of the slow-moving platform variety. Now, regardless if you go after the X Hunters, you will still be forced to fight these guys in the Sigma stages, which is yet another one of X2's missed opportunities. I mean, I understand that they'd have to make and design entirely new bosses, but come on. I collected all the pieces of Zero and yeah, I still feel empty inside. And then we got the boss rush, which is now entirely back to the way that was in the classic series, and it sucks the life out of me. Because the whole thing takes like 10 minutes, even with their weaknesses. I did praise the fact that these guys are fun to fight, but it's just so tiring to fight all of them in a row with next to no differences. Yeah, taken as a whole, I'm still pretty mixed on the endgame of X2. But, I mean, it's not all bad. Hell, the secret 100% completion reward that X1 had returns here, and it's actually hidden within Sigma's lair this time. Now, you get it in the same way as you do the Hadouken in the last game. Collect every upgrade, find every armor piece, etc. However, upon discovering a secret path within Sigma Stage 2 and skillfully dash through these spikes, you will find the capsule that nets you yet another Street Fighter move, the Shuriken. Now, in the previous vid, I spent way too long ranting about how a move like this just doesn't work in the context of a fast-paced action platformer. And while the move still has its flaws, at least in terms of functionality, the Shuriken is so much better. You do still have to put in a button combination in order for it to work, which still feels rather clunky if I'm being completely honest. But aside from that, just about everything is so much better. The move itself is a lot faster, there's no unnecessary wind-up, and it activates as soon as you enter the button combo, which makes it so much easier to be precise with. I am not kidding, it's thanks to this one change that made this move so much more enjoyable for me. And hell, I was actually able to one-shot the third boss of the Sigma stages thanks to that improvement. Says a lot. But now, with your new one-shot move and the various other abilities that you've collected, you now approach Sigma Stage 4. The climax of the game, the very last stage of the entire adventure. And it's literally just Magnus and Pete stage again. I kid you not, they literally have you play the first section of the stage over again, with next to nothing altered or changed, in any way whatsoever. It is very weird how shameless and blatant they were with that. However, after you go through all that, we get a little more development of the plot. Now, this is the only part of the game that actually cares if you got Zero back or not. If you did get Zero back, you'll see Sigma spawn in with a fake version of him, and then the real Slim Zero comes out and shuts everything down, like the beast that he is. However, if you didn't, Sigma spawns in with the actual Zero, and you have to undergo a mandatory boss fight. The boss fight that's, again, really good. Either way, Zero breaks down a path to Sigma, and now the true final battle can properly begin. And stop me if you heard this before, but this is also a fantastic boss fight. Part of me did kinda miss the climacticness and the foreboding atmosphere that the final boss of X1 had, but in terms of attack patterns and the like, this is still a massive improvement. Like before, it does have two phases, with the second of which not really being as good. I might as well bring this up now, but the physical SNES cart of X2 comes equipped with the Super Effects chip, which is this chip located in select Super Nintendo games that allows for advanced visuals, and in this game's case, pseudo 3D models. And that's pretty much all they really amount to. Sigma here is just a giant wireframe head that only has one attack and spawns enemies for you to deal with. I can admire how the fight is like X is battling some sort of demon version of Sigma, but the whole thing just feels very boring and it just leaves a lot to be desired. But you beat him, Sigma's fortress collapses for a second time, but not before we get a brief message of him basically saying that this isn't the last time that X will be seeing him, as, and I quote, "each defeat only makes him stronger." Now, just for context, this game was teased at the end of X1 after the credits, saying pretty much the same thing. However, seeing that Sigma now more so takes the form of a spirit, it makes a lot more sense of him being a recurring threat than just X killing a fake decoy of him. But anyhow, X and Zero still escape, And like the last game, they look over the cliffside and reminisce about the adventure that they just went on. X again reflects on all the fighting he's done and if all the violence that he's causing is even worth it. But he gives serious thought on whether a society made up of Reploids and humans can even coexist at all. Is a society like this costing too many lives? Is this gonna be the new way of life for humans? And if not, who or what must be sacrificed in order for there to finally be peace among them? All very difficult and disturbing questions X has to ask himself as a Maverick hunter, and none of which have very clear or definitive answers. X then rides away on his bike, for real this time, concluding megamanx 2. Man, what a follow-up this game was. I never would have foreseen this when I first played it, but this is something that rings true every time I go back to it. X2 is the point where the X series truly became its own. If X1 was the spark of light that the entire brand was depending on, X2 was that integral ignition, the moment where this formula bursted into this large and vibrant flame. The devs realized the strengths and the appeal of this concept, and took advantage of it even more so than its predecessor. The level of polish and fine-tuning applied to pretty much everything within it, especially for a sequel to such an acclaimed game, is staggering. It noticeably asks so much more from the player. It's a lot more complex in terms of its design and difficulty, it plays around with a few gimmicks here and there, and in general, it's just a much more ambitious product that truly aims to advance the series in a direction that very few publishers choose to take it in. But it all pays off. The risks this game takes are worth it, because in doing so, it ultimately leads to an incredibly fun, satisfying, rewarding, challenging, and absurdly replayable game. Again, in my personal opinion, I do still think that there are other Mega Man X style games that manage to refine this concept even further, but as it stands, at least for this series, X2 is among one of the best of them and is still my personal favorite game in the X series. However, we're just gonna snap back to reality for a little bit. X2 would not be released here in the States until 1995, and by that point, it was looking like the entire brand found itself in more or less the exact same situation as it did just 2 years prior. The industry was making big leaps forward, and it was making them faster than the X series could keep up with. And so Mega Man was once again in danger of falling behind the curve and becoming a relic of the past. But make no mistake, the team knew what they had with this formula and wasn't about to just let it all go down the drain like that. However, certain things would have to be sacrificed in order to continue this project. A majority of the team that worked on the first two games would start work on other projects for the up-and-coming PlayStation 1. So, in a series first, the next entry would be outsourced to Mikanuchi Engineering. In about a year's time, they'd go on to make the final 16-bit installment of the Mega Man X series, a game that tried to do a lot of things, but ultimately got overshadowed and forgotten to time. Nerds and geeks, the temporary decline of the X series begins now.